Golden lights bathed the grand hall of the West Africa Economic Summit in Abuja, where the region's most powerful leaders sat in silence, their eyes locked on the man at the podium, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu of Nigeria. His voice was calm, steady, but each word landed like thunder. The era of raw mineral exports is over. We will process. We will build. We will own the value right here on our land. The room froze and then erupted into thunderous applause. International media hailed it as a historic turning point, while social media exploded with hashtags like Tinubu turns, We Are Gold, and West Africa rises. From Lagos to Accra, Niamey to Dakar, millions of young West Africans felt awakened. They reposted the speech clips, added dramatic music, commented with a new sense of hope. Nigeria has finally awakened. Africa is shifting gears. Captain Traoré is no longer alone. But far away in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, in a modest office overlooking the Avenue of Revolution, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who first lit the fire of resource sovereignty in the region, did not smile. He sat in silence, fingers, interlocked eyes, locked on the screen replaying Tinubu's speech. It wasn't because he disagreed, it was because he knew politics too well, and he had seen too many reversals end in betrayal. A man who once denied our path now repeats my words, word for word, breath by breath, Traoré whispered. Beside him, his chief of internal security lowered his head in silence. The room thickened with unspoken suspicion. On the wall behind them, a large strategic map displayed flickering red dots, satellite signals, borderlines, and a newly circled zone, highlighted in deep violet, Paratrooper zone, contingency. Because some things cannot be trusted through words, not even from a man who once claimed to speak for the people. Immediately after President Tinubu's seismic speech, the Strategic Analysis Unit in Ouagadougou was ordered to review every bit of related media, not just the official recordings, but also tone, delivery, and structure. The findings were startling. Over 60% of Tinubu's address matched almost word for word a speech Captain Traoré had delivered at the AES summit just a year prior. It wasn't just the shared message, it was the exact phrasing, the symbolic mantras like from pit to plant resources must be the bedrock of sovereignty, and that widely quoted line, "We cannot allow gold to fall into the hands of those who never bled to protect it." Traoré wasn't angry, but he saw it clearly. This was no inspiration. This was political mimicry. A classified report landed on his desk at exactly 3 a.m. According to Burkina Faso's counterintelligence agency, 2 of Tinubu's top policy advisors, one a former IMF liaison, the other a former USAID director in Abuja, had secretly met with CIA representatives just 1 week before the summit. The meeting took place in a secluded villa 5 kilometers outside central Abuja, a location previously flagged as a quiet transmission hub for US-Nigeria intelligence coordination. "This is soft infiltration," concluded one of Traoré's senior security aides. They're mimicking AES rhetoric to neutralize the revolutionary momentum. Traoré remained silent. Then he walked to a regional map pinned on the wall. His finger hovered over the tri-border area between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Nigeria. He drew 3 red dots. If they think we'll be blinded by honeyed words, they haven't learned from history. Outside the window, the rain had begun to fall, but inside the war room, no one moved. A new game was unfolding, not with bullets, but with speeches that sounded like alliance, spoken by those who once turned their backs. 2 days after the Abuja summit, a sleek private jet touched down discreetly at Ouagadougou International Airport. On board was Nigeria's special envoy, a seasoned diplomat and former oil executive, carrying a personal message from President Tinubu. The proposal, a bilateral partnership to build a regional mineral processing corridor, stretching from Zamfara to Bobo Dioulasso. Tinubu sought a symbolic handshake to turn public admiration into regional integration, but the handshake never came. Captain Traoré refused to meet the envoy. Instead, a formal letter was handed over by his chief of protocol. The message, clear and firm, was delivered in Traoré's unmistakable tone. "We do not share blood with those who once held the knife. Trust cannot be built on echoes. Revolution is not collaboration, it is clarity." Within hours, the letter was leaked, possibly by intention igniting a firestorm across social media. Hashtags like Nasher no handshake, Traoré stands alone, and Africa no more puppets surged to the top of trend charts across Francophone and Anglophone Africa. Back in Abuja, Tinubu's cabinet was reportedly shocked. What was intended as a strategic rapprochement had been perceived and rebuffed as manipulation. In a joint press release just 2 days later, the AES bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced the suspension of all economic negotiations with Nigeria, citing inconsistencies between rhetoric and geopolitical posture. The statement didn't mention Tinubu by name, but the subtext was clear: Burkina Faso no longer believed in words, only deeds. In Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré summoned his top military advisors that same evening. As reports of the diplomatic breakdown reached the streets, Traoré stood before a map of the Sahel, lit only by a red desk lamp. He circled 3 points with a black marker, then drew an arc across Nigeria's northern border. "They came with smiles," he said, "but some smiles are trained." And just like that, Operation Falcon was greenlit. Deep beneath the scorching sands of the northern Sahel, in a location absent from any public map, Burkina Faso's most classified military operation was taking shape. In the echo of dimly lit tunnels, the rhythmic stomps of boots reverberated under red emergency lights. The name of this covert force was whispered only in secured corridors: Operation Falcon, Burkina Faso's first elite airborne paratrooper unit. Conceived in absolute secrecy, the unit had a single objective: rapid surgical response to any threat against the sovereignty of the AES alliance. The men and women selected were not ordinary soldiers. They were handpicked from Burkina Faso's most battle-hardened division's fighters, who had reclaimed villages from jihadists, defended mines against mercenaries, and survived drone strikes with nothing but grit and rifles. Each recruit underwent advanced training by Russian Spetsnaz veterans and Turkish airborne instructors. They practiced night parachute jumps from modified transport planes. They learned to disable radar, navigate in blackout zones, and survive behind enemy lines for days with no supplies. They trained in silence, moved in shadows, and communicated in coded clicks. No phones, no names, just ranks and mission protocols. At the heart of the base, surrounded by encrypted terminals and tactical maps, stood Captain Traoré himself. He inspected the unit one evening without ceremony. No flags, no speeches, just a silent nod to each fighter as he passed. "You are the wings we never had," he finally said, "and now we fly." The operation's doctrine was clear: deterrence through readiness. Traoré had no intention to launch a full offensive, but he was determined to ensure that any attempt at sabotage, be it political, economic, or covert, would be met with an unmistakable show of strength. In the war room, maps of West Africa were updated daily. Each AES border region was coded by threat level. Satellite images of Nigerian radar stations, foreign military advisory compounds, and potential logistic choke points were meticulously catalogued. Drones equipped with long-range surveillance circled strategic sectors. But the most chilling component of Operation Falcon wasn't its military capacity. It was its psychological intent. Traoré knew that real deterrence didn't always come from bullets. It came from making your adversary unsure, nervous guessing your next move, and nothing unnerved an opponent like an airborne force you couldn't see coming. Back in Abuja, intelligence reports began picking up encrypted transmissions and increased military flight activity near the Burkina-Niger border. Tinubu's advisors grew uneasy. A Nigerian intelligence note classified Falcon as potential destabilizing asset, warning that the unit could execute disruption operations inside Nigeria within 48 hours of deployment if ordered. Yet no public statement came from Burkina Faso. No threat, no acknowledgement, only silence and the quiet, chilling awareness that for the first time the skies above West Africa belonged to someone else. In Abuja, the silence from Ouagadougou was more deafening than any missile strike. Inside Nigeria's National Security Council, a red alert briefing unfolded under the flickering lights of a crisis room. The intelligence chief delivered the news with a flat tone, but no one missed the underlying urgency. We have confirmation Operation Falcon is real. Satellite sweeps have detected unusual airborne activity near the Niger-Burkina Faso corridor. These are not drills. President Tinubu, normally calm, clenched his jaw. He had hoped his speech would open a new chapter, an African realignment, a shared future. Instead, he now faced a growing storm fueled by mistrust. In response, the Nigerian armed forces were placed on partial mobilization. Special reconnaissance units were dispatched to the northwest border. Radar facilities in Zamfara, Katsina, and Sokoto were placed on 24-hour alert. Drone flights were increased fivefold, sweeping potential drop zones. But even as Nigeria scrambled to fortify its borders, the enemy was invisible. No threats had been issued, no violations recorded, just presence, a presence that unsettled generals and ministers alike. Behind closed doors, the intelligence community speculated. Some believed the Falcon force was designed for show psychological warfare. Others feared it could act as a vanguard in a broader AES expansion strategy. Then came a leak. A French intelligence satellite captured blurry thermal imagery of what appeared to be a high-altitude parachute drop at 3:17 a.m., just 28 kilometers from the Nigerian border. Though the drop occurred within Niger's territory, technically not a provocation, it was dangerously close. The image went viral online, despite efforts to suppress it. Analysts circled figures in mid-air, labeled coordinates, speculated wildly. Hashtags erupted. Check your sky watch. Check your Falcon drop. Chart Nigeria surrounded. The Tinubu administration scrambled for damage control. In a press conference, Nigeria's defense minister declared, "Our borders are secure. Our sovereignty is unquestioned. We will not be intimidated by covert theatrics." But the subtext was clearer to the people watching across West Africa. Nigeria was rattled. In military think tanks across Lagos, a growing realization took root. West Africa was entering a new paradigm. No longer was power solely about GDP or oil reserves. It was about agility, unpredictability, and will. And in that battlefield, Burkina Faso, once seen as a vulnerable, landlocked nation, had taken the high ground. Literally, for the first time in modern history, Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, was reacting, not leading. And that reversal was not lost on anyone. It was 3:00 a.m. on October 25th when the first shadow fell. A rumble echoed above the clouds near the tri-border area of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Nigeria. To the untrained eye, it might have been a storm, but to those monitoring encrypted frequencies, the pattern was unmistakable. Falcon unit had moved. From a high-altitude aircraft, its call sign unlisted origin, massed 12 paratroopers exited silently into the night sky. Their descent was swift, silent, and surgical. No lights, no flares, just the whisper of nylon against wind. They landed with precision 5 kilometers inside Nigerian territory, at the edge of a known Nigerian early warning radar field. But this was not an act of war. It was something far more strategic, a warning in silence. The Falcon team made no attempt to disable infrastructure. Instead, they planted a small object into the sand, a metallic AES flag, etched with the slogan, "Sovereignty is not negotiable," and then vanished into the dunes before dawn. When Nigerian border forces discovered the site hours later, they found no soldiers, no equipment, just the flag and boot prints leading back into the Sahel. Within 24 hours, the imagery of that flag went viral. Shared by anonymous sources on encrypted channels, it soon flooded the African Twitter sphere. Ex-users dubbed it the Silent Storm, comparing it to a modern revolution's version of the Berlin Wall graffiti. The impact was swift. In Nigeria, cabinet ministers demanded explanations. Was this a test A challenge, or worse, a signal that Burkina Faso could strike without ever being seen? Military analysts debated endlessly on late-night broadcasts. Some called it reckless provocation. Others praised its brilliance, a demonstration of capability without crossing the red line. Captain Traoré made no official statement, but a single image was posted on the AES media channel, him standing on a desert ridge wind, tugging at his uniform looking skyward. The caption read, "Let them look up. That is where freedom flies now." In Abuja, Tinubu convened a midnight session with his national defense team. The mood was tense. The map of Nigeria's northern frontier had been redrawn, not with ink, but with fear. And for the first time, many began to wonder, was this the start of a new kind of invasion, one from above, without bullets, yet impossible to ignore? In the blazing heat of the Sahel sun, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of a military drill ground. Around him, his soldiers trained in synchronized silence. Not a word was spoken, only the sound of wind breath and boots. He turned to his senior officers, eyes focused, voice calm. "We do not invade, but we never kneel." His words hung in the air, not a declaration of war, but a firm assertion of posture. A message for allies and adversaries alike. Burkina Faso would not be manipulated, mimicked, or muscled. Across Africa, the meaning was not lost. The skies had changed, not just literally, but symbolically. What had begun as a diplomatic gesture by Nigeria had spiraled into a regional standoff, one not fought with bullets, but with symbolism, strategy, and silence. The paratrooper dropped the planted flag, the echoing rhetoric, all threads in a new form of geopolitical messaging. And the question now buzzed across African capitals: was this just a warning shot, or the opening act of a new Cold War within Africa? In Lagos, young activists took to the streets wearing shirts emblazoned with AES symbols and the phrase, "Freedom flies." In Ghana, political talk shows debated whether their nation should align with the rising AES bloc. In Paris and Washington, nervous analysts drafted memos Sahel bloc. Beyond containment, Captain Traoré issued no follow-up speech. He didn't need to. The image of a nation that once bled in silence, now mastering the skies, said more than any microphone could. As night fell over West Africa, and satellites watched the desert with anxious eyes, one thing was clear. The revolution was no longer just on the ground. It was airborne. In the heart of West Africa, a quiet revolution is taking flight, one not born from speeches or treaties, but from the disciplined silence of paratroopers, and the thunder of dignity finally rising. The story of Operation Falcon, sparked by the tension between Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and President Bola Tinubu of Nigeria, is more than a geopolitical standoff. It is a mirror reflecting the future of African sovereignty, a future no longer dictated by colonial hand-me-downs or external endorsement, but by internal willpower, strategic posture, and psychological mastery. What began as a thunderous applause at the West Africa Economic Summit quickly turned into a tremor of mistrust. Tinubu's declaration that Nigeria would end the raw export of minerals and instead process them locally was on the surface a powerful message. Yet to those who had long walked the lonely road of resistance, it sounded too familiar, almost rehearsed, and it was. For Traoré, whose words at the AIS summit a year prior had ignited a regional awakening, Tinubu's speech wasn't flattery, it was a signal that revolution was being co-opted by those who once dismissed it. His reaction was not rage, but calculation, and from that silence emerged a doctrine rooted not in rhetoric, but in readiness. In African politics, mimicry is often more dangerous than opposition. It blurs the lines between genuine transformation and strategic containment. That is why the core of this narrative lies not in the dispute over who said what first, but in how actions revealed intent. While Tinubu extended a diplomatic handshake through envoys and press statements, his political machinery remained deeply entangled with Western interests. Two of his closest advisors with ties to IMF and USAID were reportedly in contact with CIA operatives prior to the summit. This wasn't African Renaissance, it was soft power in African clothing. So Traoré chose not to respond with speeches, but with sovereignty in motion. Operation Falcon, born from this distrust, became a metaphor of modern resistance. No public announcement, no grand unveiling, just a silent storm of elite airborne troops, trained in darkness, moving through the sky, like whispers of rebellion. A force designed not for invasion, but for deterrence, for psychological dominance, over those who believe diplomacy can be disguised manipulation. The drop of an AES flag in Niger, just kilometers from the Nigerian radar zone, was not an act of war. It was theater with intent, a minimalist move that cost nothing in blood, yet reshaped the entire diplomatic calculus of the region. It sent a clear message: the AES bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had developed the capability to act swiftly and visibly and symbolically. They now spoke the language of modern deterrence: ambiguity, unpredictability, and precision. And it worked. Nigeria, with all its economic might and military scale, was rattled not because of what Traoré did, but because of what he could do. The fear of the invisible became more potent than 1,000 marching battalions. Satellite images, blurry and unconfirmed, sparked more anxiety than missiles ever could. It is the genius of psychological warfare. You don't need to attack when your opponent is busy defending shadows. Yet this confrontation also raises a broader question for Africa. What kind of unity are we building? Is it one where larger nations absorb the revolutionary language of smaller states for soft assimilation? Or is it one where mutual respect, rooted in historical struggle and uncompromising clarity, defines the terms of alliance? Traoré's refusal to accept Tinubu's overture wasn't arrogance. It was a principled stance rooted in memory. Africa has long suffered from leaders who shake hands in daylight and sign away resources at midnight. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, has decided that no such hand will be accepted unless the other arm bears scars of the same struggle. The symbolism of the skies is profound. Historically, air dominance has been a privilege of colonial and neo-colonial powers. From French Mirage jets in Mali to American drones in Niger, the sky has long been the realm where Africa's sovereignty was breached. Now the Falcon unit turns that history on its head. A landlocked country often dismissed as peripheral now asserts airborne capacity, not for conquest but for dignity. Young Africans watching from Lagos, Accra, Bamako, or Kinshasa are no longer waiting for elections or international endorsements. They're watching for symbols, for actions, for movements that redefine what it means to be free. And Traoré, without uttering a word, gave them a symbol that spoke louder than any politician ever could: a flag in the sand, a whisper in the sky, and a refusal to kneel. This is not just Burkina Faso's story. It is a turning point in African political evolution. It challenges every leader, every nation to choose. Will you speak the language of freedom, or will you live it? Will you imitate courage, or will you embody it? Operation Falcon is not the end of a saga. It is the prologue to a new African century. One where sovereignty is airborne and independence is encrypted in every act of defiance. One where Africa no longer reacts, but defines the terms of engagement. The true revolution is not in the drop of troops, it is in the rise of self-respect. And so, as the world watches West Africa with caution, perhaps even fear, a new chapter is being written, not with ink, but with flight paths, silence, and maps drawn in resolve. Let them look up. That is where freedom flies now. As the AES flag fluttered in the Sahel winds, etched with the phrase, "Sovereignty is not negotiable," a continental shift was underway, not because of its physical presence, but because of the idea it embodied, that in this age of hybrid warfare and neo-colonial maneuvers, the most dangerous weapon Africa could wield was no longer the gun. It was discipline, memory, and an unshakable clarity of purpose. In Abuja, in Paris, and Washington, think tanks scrambled to interpret the move. Was it a threat, a drill? A challenge to ECO was unity. To those trapped in an outdated paradigm of international politics, the Falcon drop seemed irrational, risky. But to African thinkers attuned to the symbolic language of resistance, it was an act of genius. A silent revolution where no bullets flew, but power visibly shifted. This new era, pioneered by leaders like Traoré, is not interested in pleasing old empires. It's focused on constructing new ones, built from African blueprints, not Western frameworks. It's about recentering the continent in its own narrative, reclaiming what has long been dictated from embassies and donor summits. And in that process, language, gesture, and timing become as vital as any missile. The rejection of Tinubu's envoy was therefore more than a diplomatic rebuff. It was a warning to every African leader tempted to borrow the aesthetics of revolution while serving the interests of those who suppressed it. Burkina Faso was declaring that Pan-Africanism must come not just with slogans, but with sacrifice. The most profound transformation is occurring not at presidential palaces, but in the consciousness of African youth. In every university classroom where AES symbols now appear on laptops. In every street mural depicting Traoré not as a warlord, but as an engineer of destiny. In every encrypted chat group where the words, "We fly now," resonate like an oath. The message is clear. Africa will no longer be the testing ground for foreign agendas. It will be the forge of its own. This doesn't mean isolation or conflict. On the contrary, it signals the birth of a new diplomacy, one grounded in mutual respect, not manipulation, one in which strategic alignment is earned through transparency, not mimicry, in which sovereignty is not a transactional bargaining chip, but the very condition for engagement. The psychological brilliance of Operation Falcon lies in its paradox. It accomplished everything without doing anything overt. No infrastructure damaged, no borders breached, no soldiers lost. Yet the geopolitical landscape tilted. The old giants grew cautious. The silent grew loud. Traoré's refusal to retaliate in kind, his rejection of escalation in favor of deterrence, is the sign of a mature revolution, not one driven by vengeance but by vision. The creation of a force like Falcon is not preparation for war. It's a shield against betrayal, against infiltration, against the soft coups disguised as partnerships. As Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger deepen their AES alliance, they are setting a precedent for post-colonial unity, rooted not in declarations but doctrine, a new framework of trust forged not in Geneva or Brussels, but in the heat of survival and the clarity of betrayal. Africa is watching, and the world for once is listening. Not to what is being said, but to what is being done. Because in this new chapter of African history, silence may be the loudest signal of all. And in that silence, something extraordinary is taking shape, an Africa that no longer kneels, no longer waits, and no longer apologizes for defending its sky. The rise of Operation Falcon marks more than a strategic shift, it marks a cultural one. For decades, African defense has been defined by reaction, reacting to terror threats, to debt traps, to foreign interventions dressed as aid. But what Traoré has engineered without firing a shot is a complete reversal of posture. Burkina Faso, once on the defensive, is now setting the terms. The silent drop of 12 paratroopers became a masterclass in symbolic power, a recalibration of what it means to hold the initiative. Young Africans, especially in post-colonial states, where betrayal has been normalized, now see a different model of leadership. One that does not chase applause or play the puppet for international validation. One that trains in secret, prepares in silence, and moves when others least expect it. This is the kind of leadership that endures not because it's loud, but because it's rooted in something deeper than ambition. Conviction that Africa's destiny is no longer up for negotiation. This is why the symbolic flag, planted in Nigerian adjacent territory, matters so deeply. It was not a taunt to Nigeria, it was a warning to the world. Africa will no longer be reshaped by those who do not bleed for it. Tinubu's speech was powerful, yes, but it was reactive. Traore's silence. That was proactive, that was power. The world is now learning that African silence can be strategic, that its quietest leaders can be its most dangerous to foreign interests, that speeches written in D.C., think tanks can no longer pacify a continent awakening to its own reflection. This shift also has implications for alliances across the continent. Ghana, Senegal, Chad, and even South Africa are watching closely. They are witnessing the emergence of a new metric of leadership, one not based on GDP or Western approval, but on the ability to hold your ground without blinking. To build deterrence not through tanks, but through trust earned among your own people. What the West fears most is not Burkina Faso's military capability, it's the model Traoré represents. A model that could be replicated. One that unites military discipline with political clarity and cultural authenticity. One that doesn't beg for loans but demands fair trade. One that doesn't mimic the West but defends against its mimicry. In that sense, Operation Falcon is not just a warning, it is a prototype. A prototype for African autonomy, for psychological warfare that protects without provoking, for sovereignty built in silence, not showmanship. What the global intelligence community now realizes, but cannot publicly admit, is that the most destabilizing force in West Africa is not instability. It is coherence. Strategic sovereign coherence from a bloc of nations once dismissed as fragile states. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have rewritten that script, scripted not in press conferences, but in the shadows above Sahel skies. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all in trying to neutralize the AES movement through appropriation and flattery. Nigeria only amplified it. In rejecting the copy, Africa was reminded of the original. In mimicking, Traoré, Tinubu unintentionally crowned him. Because in this, Africa leadership is not earned by echoing others. It is earned by standing alone when it is hardest. And that now is the standard. Across classrooms, border camps, and military academies from Kinshasa to Kampala, young Africans are asking new questions. What is sovereignty worth? How do we defend it? And how do we make sure the next century is not another cycle of dependence, but of dignity? The answer may no longer lie in capital cities or on trade floors. It may be falling silently through the sky. As dawn breaks over the Sahel, and encrypted frequencies continue to pulse across the desert, one truth remains unchanged. Africa is no longer waiting. Africa is airborne. The winds of the Sahel no longer carry only sand, they carry a message. A message that echoes from the ridges of Ouagadougou to the ports of Lagos. Africa is no longer terrain to be negotiated. It is now a force to be reckoned with. And in that force, Ibrahim Traoré has emerged not merely as a soldier or a president, but as a symbol, a mirror held up to the African continent. A mirror that asks uncomfortable but necessary questions. Who speaks for Africa? Who dares to lead without seeking permission? And who among us is willing to prepare in silence rather than perform for applause? The brilliance of Operation Falcon lies not just in its military logistics or its psychological advantage, but in its philosophical statement. It is an African response to centuries of foreign presence that assumed superiority, a response that does not scream but whispers with unshakable confidence. We no longer need validation. We are the storm. For centuries, Africa was seen as a passive subject, its maps drawn in Europe, its futures negotiated in Paris or Washington. Today, a new cartography is being drawn, not on paper, but in the sky, not with pens, but with paratroopers, and not by outsiders, but by sons and daughters of the soil, who bleed not for medals, but for memory. The world should pay attention not just to what Traore is doing, but to how he is doing it. He speaks little, he reveals even less. But each move is calibrated like a chess master preparing the endgame. He knows the difference between noise and narrative, between gestures that entertain and strategies that endure. This is why his silence rattles more than any speech. This is why a single flag planted in sand has shaken an entire region more than 1,000 treaties ever could. Because true revolutionaries do not warn, they act. And when they do, they change the definition of what is possible. Traoré's Africa is one where airspace is not just about surveillance, but about symbolism, where dignity is not begged for in Western boardrooms, but defended in desert drills, where unity is not dictated by ECOWAS mandates, but earned through shared pain and shared clarity. And this is only the beginning. The AES alliance, once mocked as fragile, is becoming the most ideologically cohesive bloc on the continent. Its doctrine is simple: no compromise on sovereignty, no tolerance for foreign puppetry, no future dictated from abroad. Other African nations are watching, recalibrating their own strategies, debating their allegiances. And beyond the continent, old powers are realizing, with increasing unease, that Africa is no longer a continent of reaction. It is a continent of preparation. So as satellites scan the dunes, as diplomats scramble for relevance, and as generals watch the sky, one thing becomes undeniable. A new paradigm has arrived, one not written in the language of submission, but in the silence of strength. One carried not on official flights, but on the wings of paratroopers who land without warning. One that does not ask the world to understand, but dares it to respect. In this, Africa revolution is not chaos, it is coordination. Resistance is not protest, it is posture. And freedom is no longer a dream, it is a drop zone, a doctrine, a direction, and it flies now.